again. He will be working somewhat from the original outline that we worked from. He has new comments. He's studied some of our other ordinances and other projects that are on the table. And he will be, we're going to structure this, I think, in that Charlie will do a section of his presentation, and then we'll invite anyone to make comments after each section and see if that works for us. Also tonight we have someone from the Environmental Action Committee, Sloan Walker, and he has a brief additional presentation that we'll seek to accommodate in a timely fashion. Okay, Charlie, it's all yours. Okay, we'll do that. Let's do that.
Thank you.
I hope.
Okay, if it is, then you need mic.
Be sure to talk to them.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. My name is Sloan Walker, and I'm a representative of the Radnor Environmental Advisory Council, the EAC. Skip, as the Planning Commission's representative to the EAC, has done a great job keeping us informed of the Planned Institutional Zoning District Initiative. Thank you, Skip. Appreciate it. We also appreciate the work of the entire Planning Commission and the Township staff on this important issue. The EAC has formed a working group to review the proposed zoning ordinance and would like to work with the Planning Commission as it conducts its important work. The EAC's focus will be on the environmental aspects of the zoning ordinance. We have a few informational requests for the consultant, Mr. Schmale. First of all, we'd appreciate it if the consultant, Charlie, would provide the EAC with examples of environmental provisions built into ordinances both in our region and nationally for communities similar to Radnor in terms of size and economic makeup. For example, it would be very interesting to us to learn of provisions regarding stormwater management, energy efficiency such as geothermal or solar systems, solar power systems, transportation such as connections to public transportation, access to electric vehicle charging stations, and provisions to reduce pollution, including noise pollution, light pollution, or air pollution. We'd also be very interested to learn about ways for the ordinance to provide incentives for institutions to include environmental provisions in their plans. For example, we understand that Radnor Township has a provision in their zoning ordinance which provides for zoning bonuses for new construction which meets standards set by the U.S. Green Building Council. As another example, Doylestown's zoning and planning department has a green building incentive program through which developers can earn reductions in permitting fees in exchange for using sustainable building methods. We think these are interesting ideas. We'd like to look at what else is out there and working with the Planning Commission, figure out what might work and be a good idea for Radnor. So a few requests. We'd appreciate help from Charlie and from the Planning Commission.
Thank you very much, Sloan. I think it's a timely set of requests. I do have a bias because I'm liaison to the committee, but since this is the first major section of our zoning code that we're beginning to work on, this is the time to look into the corners as well as the main event.
Yes, I had a chance to talk to Mr. Walker about this matter before the meeting started. We wrote similar provisions for the City of Bethlehem with incentives for LEED certification, for green roofs, and other matters. It was mainly a building and impervious and height incentives if you met certain minimum requirements. And it should work very well because the institutions are more likely to want to participate in these types of things. So it provides a test mechanism for some ideas that we can then propose to spread throughout the entire township in the future. Okay?
Could I just mention one thing?
Yes.
Along those lines. Currently, we don't have any criteria for judging a green roof, what its requirements are. And I think, number one, we need that, both in residential and institutional business and so forth. Because I know there were some green roofs that came before zoning, and the concept of green roof on top of a parking lot and so forth. And we're really flying by the seat of our pants on that because Radnor has no written criteria on whether or not it should be pervious or impervious.
Okay.
And so I think examples from other townships that have done this already, and then we can tweak it. My other concern is if we give on too many things, I'm concerned about the property getting denser, and then they get to go higher in the building, and then they have more space. Then they want to come in for a variance so they can build another building in the space that they have. So I'm a little concerned with giving too much away in the way of setbacks and things like that. Just something to keep in mind.
There needs to be upper limits.
Yeah.
Yeah, could I just add a comment on that? As I understand some of the provisions, I'm sorry. As I understand some of the provisions in some of the townships that do these kind of incentive programs, it's, at least in some of the townships, it's discretionary. So the bonuses are reviewed and are not, by right. They would be a proposal and worked out and approved either by the Planning Commission or by the Board of Commissioners. So there's sort of different ways to do it. I'm sure some are mandatory and others are more flexible and could be reviewed and perhaps worked out case by case. So I think there are different ways to.
I'm a little concerned with discretionary because sometimes in certain cases we won't indicate what that might be at this point. But more discretion is given to the applicant than should be given.
I think you meant discretionary for the township to.
I know,
That's-
but that's
that's
what I
exactly-
mean. That's exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
Too
Well, I
much
think that's the balance.
discretion is given to the commissioners to allow certain things for certain applicants.
Understood. Well, that's the kind of thing that I think we'd be very interested in looking at, seeing what the options are, and figuring out what the balance that works best at Radnor would be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have a quick question for you. Does the USBGBC Green Buildings Council have a recommendation as to what constitutes a green roof, whether that's permeable, impermeable, or what? Do you
They
happen to know that?
probably do. I'd have to look at the guidelines. I don't have them. I don't know them as well as I should.
I'm shocked. That you,
Well, see, an architect could tell you instantly, but I'm not an architect, so I have to look at the book.
You'd actually be surprised. You'd be
Charlie,
surprised.
Yes.
When you look at those standards for that Kathy mentioned about assessing a green roof,
Yes.
if you could add to the list also pervious paving.
Okay?
That's another thing. That's another area where institutions, in particular, could perhaps do themselves a favor and the township a favor. Thanks.
Yes, and that I know more about, and our office knows more about.
The township at one time allowed that, now they don't because they're concerned with it getting paved over with regular paving.
Well,
Not-
that
not-
would be a violation.
Yeah,
Of
but
an
you have to
approved
stay
plan.
on top of it, and that's the problem with it. But put your suggestions in, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Again, my name's Charlie Schmale. I'm with a firm called Urban Research and Development Corporation. Our contact information is on the memo. If you did not get a copy of the memo, there are some copies over there. on the
Excuse me,
table.
Charlie,
Yes.
if this would be more comfortable for you, we have this. Okay.
What we did was we took the memo that we had given you. I think this is okay. We took the memo that we had given you back in June, and we added to it and expanded upon it, and those revisions show up in italics. And I don't want to read it to you, and I don't want to repeat things that we've already talked about. If you want to jump to page 3, you see a discussion about what is in the current planned industrial zoning district, some of the highlights of it. And Then we get to the zoning map on page 4. And if the commission members want to speak up about anything, please feel free, and then we'll open it up every so often for public comment. On page 4 then, the zoning map.
Charlie, wait.
Yes, please.
Before you get to the zoning map, you added some italics at the top of the page about making the distinctions between the various setbacks.
Yes.
And that you have a recommendation here that the 200-foot setback be measured from the lot line of a residential lot in a residential district. And because this is in italics, I assume you either had some further thought or input or what have you on that, if you could just comment about that.
Sure. What we're trying to do is emphasize the setbacks where they're most valuable. The setbacks are particularly, that is at the top of page 4, the third section on the top of page 4. We want to emphasize the setbacks where they're most important because you only have so much room for setbacks. You're pushing people one direction, you're pushing people another direction. Where do you actually want them to build? And if we start using large setbacks from every single side, there's not much left. Our main goal is to have large setbacks for the uses that are more problematic from the residential lots. We're not looking for large setbacks necessarily from a road. We're not looking for large setbacks against another institution or a church or another business. We're looking for large setbacks between the more intense institutional uses and the houses. And that's what we're proposing to emphasize there.
Doesn't that effectively bring the most intense use, which has the 200-foot setback? The way that I'm reading that, what that's saying is that the setbacks that have 200 feet, student housing, food services, parking structures, et cetera.
Yes.
You're now recommending that they be measured from the lot line of the residential lot.
Yes.
Rather than from the edge of the residential district, which if I read that correctly, it effectively decreases the distance buffer between some of our most intense uses and a residential lot. And I would think that would be the exact place we'd want to keep it.
It does two things. It slightly reduces the setback if there's a road separating the two. It might separate them by 20 feet less if there's a road, because it's the width to the center line of the right-of-way. And it would reduce the setbacks if there is a non-residential use in that residential district. So, for instance, if you had a cemetery or a church or a non-conforming business in that residential district, that use would not get the larger setback because it's not a house. It's a minor change, but we're just trying to refine the setbacks to emphasize what's most important.
If it was why wouldn't you use the property line of the cemetery, for example, if it's in a residential area?
Under this
Or does it say
scenario,
residences specifically?
under this scenario, that would be a 75-foot setback. The 75 feet is the default setback.
Excuse me, Charles, what you're saying are basically possible recommendations.
Sure. You
not-
can tell me that you don't like these ideas.
Okay,
That's why we're here.
okay.
But again, you know, I think we're trying to prioritize the regulations as much as we can. The houses are the things that deserve the most protection.
Maybe it's the wrong order of operations, and tell me if it is, and I can wait till the end of all of this. And I appreciate all the background that you've done here. But one of the things that I'm struggling with is, what are we as a commission looking to fix? If the setbacks were never an issue for us, why would we have a conversation about changing that particular setback? And so, like, at a higher level, I'm thinking, have we spent much time talking about the aspects of the planned institution ordinance that we feel don't work well for the tax-paying residents of Radnor Township, balanced with institutions needing to grow and balance, grow and be vibrant, because that brings a benefit to us. And I don't personally feel like we've had much of a conversation about that So I don't know where to go with that.
I think it's difficult to put our hands around this. This is probably the toughest single section we could have started with. That being said, off the cuff, one of my priorities would be to take that really hard look at parking. I think that's been a consistent problem. The setback issue, I think it's still something that has to be addressed. I mean, the Cabrini proposal we looked at a little while ago, some of the neighbors had concerns about setback because it was such a massive project and it was, 120 feet from the road and lots of trees were going, things like that. So the setback could have protected and preserved more trees. And I think we're going to see something different on Tuesday, but.
Maybe the setback should be relative to the height of the building.
Well,
I think Charlie would agree with that.
Maybe higher order, maybe what we ought to do, and because I know you're here and you have lots to share with us, is listen to everything. And then we're going to probably have to go back and talk about as a group, gosh, are setbacks really a concern for us? Is that something we want to, really look to change? Is parking really an issue? I think we're going to say parking is, and there'll be some other ones that we will say are, and we will say that there are others that are not. But do you hear what I'm saying? Is that we may listen to everything.
In other words, where do we start?
We may have to listen to everything to then say, okay, we still have to go back and kind of look at everything. And I'm okay with that. I don't necessarily have an issue with some aspects of our PI zoning. I think that they worked fine, and other aspects I think didn't. Okay.
I think I agree with you, Sue, and I'm going to recommend that we don't jump in on Charlie right now for a while.
Well,
Just let him go.
If you do have a strong reaction, I'd like to hear it. But I think this will take time for everybody to digest it.
Okay. Maybe we shouldn't get into like the little nitty gritty, but if there's something we think is glaringly missing, mention that.
Just scream out, "You're wrong."
Yeah.
I think that we should, through the course of this evening, come up with focused issue areas like parking or noise and stuff like that as the issues that we want to address and prioritize.
I don't think we're disagreeing with that. I just want Charlie to have his speech or say or whatever.
Okay.
Well, I also feel like through the process, bringing in an outside consultant, the point of that is for them to point out things that we haven't already addressed or identified ourselves, and looking forward, things that we might need to meet up with in the future. So I think it's important to not, to let the expert be the expert, you know what I'm saying?
Well, you know the township better than I do, and I'm not elected, so I will definitely defer to the township officials. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. You tell us what results you want, and we'll find a way to get there. We are assuming that the zoning map will not change. The comprehensive plan says keep the institutional boundaries where they are, and no one has suggested to me any difference. If you are aware of some changes that we should look at, we can do that, but right now we're assuming the boundaries stay where they are. The Villanova proposal is the subject of the greatest public interest, and it's the most immediate issue before the township with the greatest change. So we don't want the Villanova proposals to consume this entire process, but we would be derelict if we don't pay a lot of attention to it. So there is a balance there. In the memo, you see a updated discussion of what is proposed, and we have referenced to you the township provided a large list of questions from residents to Villanova in writing that came out of meetings. Villanova has posted 28 pages of responses to those questions, which anybody can read on their website. We've pulled some things out of those discussions as we've updated this memo. You see lists of some of the things that are proposed and some of the policies that are being discussed as far as the Villanova project. There's certainly discussion about what type and sizes of commercial uses. Well, first off, let me assume that all of this discussion assumes that the township wishes to see the land south of Lancaster Avenue that's controlled, the parking lots that are controlled by Villanova, that the township would want to move forward with some type of change there. Once that policy decision or alternative is assumed, then we look at what we feel is the best way to do it and the best way to balance the many interests. There's issues about the amount and type of commercial, the amount of parking. There's issues about the heights of the buildings, about the designs and buffering in a way to minimize impacts for the neighbors. And then there are a whole series of non-zoning issues that deserve discussion, but that we personally can't deal with. As part of this, we've noted that there is now a draft zoning amendment that was submitted to the township by Villanova's attorneys, and we've referenced some of those items in this memo. That proposal would require conditional use by the Board of Commissioners. The process is that a zoning ordinance can allow additional types of intensities development as a conditional use. It is an allowed use if you meet the requirements of the ordinance. There would be hearings before the Board of Commissioners, and they would approve the zoning of the project. And they would approve this new type of development, which Villanova is proposing to call Comprehensive Integrated College Development, CICD. It's a real catchy acronym. As part of that, they're proposing, for instance, no building setbacks at all from the south side of Lancaster Avenue. We think there should be at least a minimum setback to have some green buffer around the foundation plantings. They're proposing that, we think there is a good reason to have buildings closer to Lancaster Avenue because it helps to keep the buildings further away from the houses. You have a little more room to push the buildings forward. And the township in many other parts of Lancaster Avenue has been encouraging buildings to be closer to Lancaster Avenue as part of a new urbanism, traditional neighborhood development village concept to have buildings with a good streetscape, street trees, decorative sidewalks, benches, decorative street lights, foundation plantings, and then the building relatively close to the street, and trying to do everything you can to not have parking between the building and the street, and to keep the sidewalks uninterrupted so that they're safer for pedestrians without many driveway crossings. So that we believe there is a rationale to have the buildings closer to the street. The proposal does not include much of a setback from the SEPTA line, though. We think that's where it's important, again, put the buildings further away from the houses to the south and push them closer to Lancaster Avenue. And that buffering on the south side closest to the houses would be critical. And the latest discussion that we read is a continuous site of evergreen trees along the Route 100 line. The proposal that was submitted to the township proposes a 65 feet height limit. We believe that's too tall. At the same time, there are some 5-story buildings on the Villanova campus. There's some 4-story buildings too, so it's not out of the question that there be some taller buildings. We're trying to look for compromises, and we believe a 4-story building would be a reasonable compromise for this particular area, assuming that there's adequate buffering, adequate controls of loading docks and loading operations and things of that nature. The parking deck is proposed to be 57 feet, and the tallest part of the building is proposed to be 54 feet of the student housing. We'd like to see more control over the types of commercial uses. Right now, some of the terminology is very broad, and we can certainly understand dining facilities, restaurant facilities, makes sense. Certainly any facilities that serve the students themselves, such as exercise facilities, is common. A very small convenience store is often found in a student housing complex, but it should very much be a small facility. And For some of these commercial uses, we would suggest that they be very much oriented towards the interior of the building without their own exterior entrance, without their own exterior signage along Lancaster Avenue. Because we believe in this case, the commercial uses really are primarily designed to serve the students and staff and not the general public. As part of that, we're concerned about the parking lot that's shown west of the Ethan Avenue, Lancaster Avenue intersection. We think that's going to be problematic for traffic. And the more you have commercial uses that serve the general public, the more need there is for that parking area. If you're only serving students and staff, you don't need that parking area at all. We think the main student bookstore, apparel store belongs in the main campus. We think it's too high traffic a use to be on this site. We think it belongs in the center of campus. The materials that have been distributed say that the township has told Villanova that the pedestrian crossing is a precondition of any further discussion. I don't know if that was an official policy statement of the Board of Commissioners or if Villanova is just reading the tea leaves and understanding that, but their statement says that they are working on alternatives to have a pedestrian underpass or overpass. Even though they don't think it's needed, they recognize the township is demanding it, and they're trying to find a way to make it work.
Could I just mention a little history here?
Please.
Villanova has been promising that since the early 90s. And it's been part of many plans before where the Planning Commission asked specifically for it as part of, I think it was the DuPont Pavilion and other things that were built on the south side. So we've been asking for it for 20-some years. It's been promised for 20-some years. It has yet to appear. And I think nothing should happen there until there's some way, safe way to get students across, which is not a light that allows kids to run across in traffic.
If there is flexibility on the building setbacks and you can have building extensions on both sides of the road or connected into an overpass, it can work well. You can't expect students on a daily basis to go up and down 2 flights of steps on each side of the road. It's not going to happen. They're going to run across anyway.
Well, they did talk about an underpass. And
An underpass
it would
is
just
another.
go under, Ethan Avenue would be sloped down and would just go straight across.
That certainly is an alternative, and it's for them to come back and find out what the most feasible way to do it is.
Charlie, are you familiar with Swarthmore Borough?
I've driven through it a few times, but I don't know it very well.
If you could take a look at some pictures, I'd welcome your perspective from a planning perspective of how it might work to drop Lancaster Avenue underneath an overpass, the way that 320 is dropped under basically the train station in the village of Swarthmore.
I think you'd have an easier time dropping Ethan than you would dropping Lancaster.
Ethan.
Sorry,
well, we
Ethan.
have a much longer stretch of Lancaster, and it's the much busier road. Anyway, 320 is the much busier road than the little borough. And my husband suggested that, is that rather than talking about building a bridge or building a pedestrian underpass, which you did mention some of the safety concerns of that, basically just get the busy Lancaster Avenue traffic on an underpass and not even interacting with the Ethan intersection. So don't answer tonight from a planning perspective. If you could look at that intersection at 320 in
Yeah, I have driven that just a couple weeks ago, and I know exactly what you mean. The road
Doing
does
something
dip
similar with
under
that.
the railroad overpass.
Yep, with Lancaster.
The concern is you have to make sure traffic's flowing while you're doing construction. So I don't know if you could reasonably dig Lancaster Avenue at a lower elevation while still letting traffic flow. I don't know if you could make that work.
Boston pulled it off. It was called the Big Dig. They did it.
It cost $20 billion of federal money. It took 20 years. But they say their professionals are reviewing those alternatives and we're getting back to the township with what they think will work. We'd suggest that the zoning limit the housing in this area at upperclassmen. That's what's being promised. The freshmen are typically the more rowdier students. If we limit the upperclassmen, hopefully they're a little more serious. There are a lot of concerns we can't put into a zoning ordinance. A lot of the issues about adjacent roads, for instance, about speed humps, about whether Villanova vehicles are allowed to use Aldwyn Lane. I do have one correction here. I had noted that there should be speed tables or speed humps on Meadowwood. There are 2 right now. So that's already been done. But the point being is that there can be agreements between either a university or a college and the neighbors association, or separate agreements between the university or college and the township that are outside of zoning that can address issues that cannot be put into the zoning ordinance. The one thing we cannot do is have anything that looks like it's contract zoning, where someone says, I will pay $1 million to the fire company if you give me the zoning change. We can't have anything that looks like that. But certainly there can be outside agreements to deal with traffic issues and other matters, and behavior issues and things of that nature. There is a preliminary traffic study done, which I have not seen yet, and there is a more detailed traffic study that's promised. Those were the main things I had to say about Villanova, other than parking we'll get to in a second. Now might be a good time to go over any comments or questions people have on that section, what we talked about so far.
So one of the things I noted is you made mention of the height of the buildings. In the WBOD, where you had talked about the Wayne Business Overlay District.
Yes.
When you mentioned that there are parts of the town that have pulled the buildings closer to the street and have allowed for more height, the WBOD still limits it to 42 feet. So, as we're talking about scale for any of Lancaster Avenue or any of our universities, I think it would be helpful for everybody to drive down Lancaster and understand that, probably the exception of the church, which I'm assuming is a pre-existing nonconformity, the building height is 42. And how much tolerance do we have to go taller than that? I don't have much tolerance for it. But I would just,
Well,
just
I think
know
if
that that's the number.
If it's interior, I don't have a problem
Well,
with it.
but, he was
But
referencing
not
pulling
necessarily
buildings
along
closer to the
Lancaster
street.
Avenue. I would agree on that.
No, it just was, he asked us to comment on what we've seen so far.
Our suggestion is, on that segment, 4 stories, 51 feet. And the 51 feet gives you a little more architectural interest. If you say 40 feet, you might just get a flat roof, which doesn't serve anybody any purpose.
Right. And then the other comment that you have written here is the 160-foot building length requirement.
What page is that?
That's
That
on
is
page
on
4.
page 4.
And you're suggesting
Center of the page.
deleting that. As I read that, kind of regardless of the university or the institution involved, I struggled to think what the benefit of a longer than 160-foot building could be, other than being of benefit to the cheaper for the developer to build, but that doesn't necessarily bring benefit to the township.
I mean, there's a lot of great architecture that's longer than 160 feet long.
Okay. I mean, I'd have to see it.
And a football field is 100 yards, 300 feet, so it's half the length of a football field. So, yeah, it sounds like a lot of feet, but it's not as big as you might think.
I think it's
Not
the
for-
articulation and the variation in the building that makes more difference other than the length.
No, I'm not saying, I'm not going with you. I'm just
Okay.
pointing out, 150 feet is not long.
And I also
Right, maybe I
think,
have to see something for perspective.
and the other thing is, we're not bound to just let it be open-ended. Just because Charlie's suggesting we go from 160 to no particular limit doesn't mean that we have to do that.
Right, that was, these are some of the comments he made, that he asked for feedback. That's what really kind of, those are the few things that, of a general nature, that stuck out for me, at least in terms of the, kind of the general things that you mentioned. I personally think that we as a township will be better served by thinking about what's best for the township and not becoming entrenched in Villanova's plan and not feeling like we have to think about what aspects of Villanova's plan we may or may not agree with. because that will end up driving our ordinance in a way that I think is in a way that I think is probably the definition of spot zoning. Or when I think about it, it's a very specific project that they've put out very specific numbers. And if we start working off of that, I'm not sure that for the Planning Commission, I'm not sure that that's good for the general PI ordinance, particularly given that they're taking a completely different track, which is a zoning overlay, and that needs to play out kind of separately. And some issues that have been brought to light there, we should be thinking about for the whole township, but not become entrenched in Villanova's plan.
Yeah, I should clarify for everyone that the provisions we're talking about on the Lancaster Avenue site would not necessarily apply to the whole PI district, that if it is a separate overlay, we can structure those provisions differently than the rest of the PI.
I mean, the whole purpose of your coming here, of course, is to deal with 12 institutions.
Yes, but there's really 3 that are doing a lot of activity out of those 12.
Today.
Correct, correct. We are looking long-term also. You're correct.
Okay. I had one small comment about the discussion you had in the memo about the parking garage. In other zoning ordinances, I noticed that in this garage, they're suggesting that 1 story would be underground. That seems like something that they may have elected to do as opposed to being required to do. And in other zoning areas, could we legitimately, if there's going to be, say, 5 or 6 levels, require that 2 be underground?
It's a lot more expensive to go underground. The numbers I've seen say it's about twice as expensive per space to go underground as above ground. You need more ventilation, and the ramps don't work as well.
I understand, and I've been in an underground garage once or twice, but I meant if they have a compelling need for that much parking, that maybe the trade-off is, or could be, that we have to have at least 1 floor or 2 underground, or partially underground, or look to a site where some of it can be underground.
Usually, they try to build a deck so that part of it is worked into the slopes as best they can. It's a normal way to build a deck. So usually some of it is naturally built into the ground. Whether that level has to be completely underground would be more difficult. I think part of that is you put a maximum height that kind of pushes them to do more underground. But when we get to the parking section, one of the things Villanova has said in the materials that they've made public is they don't want to build that big a deck. They'd actually would like to build a smaller deck, but they say the township's requirements are making them build that big a deck. They actually, the way I read this is they would like to build less spaces than they're eliminating. They're eliminating 1,700 spaces and building 1,800 spaces, and they'd prefer to build maybe 1,400 if they had the choice. Considering the complaints we've heard about parking and concerns about sports events and graduations, it may be in the best interest of the township to have a larger deck.
What I was going to bring up generally is that one of the things this does remind me of, a glaring omission that we need to address in this, is we have no parking standards for a parking garage.
You mean no dimensional?
We have, it's not considered a building, or there's something about our zoning. Peter or Kevin, maybe you can.
It's a structure, not a building, is the usual definition.
Right, and so we don't have some of the same limitations and controls on it, and that's
Why
hurt us
can't it
in-
be? Why can't we call it a building?
You can.
Well, that's
You
the
just have
thing,
to
is
say
that we need
Okay.
to, we need
Well,
to
let's-
address that.
Let's call it a building then.
That's
So,
one of the issues
yeah.
that, in my opinion,
we've
we
run
need to
into,
address,
yeah.
whether it's in general parking requirements or it's in PI.
It's a loophole.
We need to
Yeah.
get rid of the loophole about
I agree.
about parking garages being considered structures and not buildings, because
Right.
then they're not subject to any of the design standards that would make them.
Or landscaping, yeah.
Lots of
Anything.
design
Yep.
standards that could make them more appealing. Yeah, so that was a general.
Good catch.
I'm kind of floundering, and I don't know where to start on this. And I agree that we shouldn't let Villanova University be the tail that wags the dog. And I was looking at the requirements in the zoning book here where they specifically lay out sizes and so forth, setbacks. And maybe we should start generically with that and see whether we like what those sizes are at that point, and then look at how that maybe fits with some of the universities that we currently have. I think we all agree that one of the major problems is parking. There's just not enough of it in any of the institutions that are expanding, and all the parking oozes into the streets. And the residential areas, especially some of the residential areas like R4 and R5, there's no parking there. I mean, the residents barely have enough room for parking, let alone the college kids parking there and walking up onto the campus. So I think the setbacks, number one, need to be relative to the size of the building. So if they want a taller building, they need a longer setback. And I think I would kind of almost like to look at setbacks and where we are at this point and whether we think that is adequate in most of the situations that we run into, and then perhaps look at it relative to the different institutions and how we weren't able to control the development because of this or that. And I think we all agree parking is number one on that. I am not against allowing a taller building if it's in the interior of the campus. If the green stays around it and they aren't later allowed to put more density on that. They need to maintain a certain amount of green around it that stays green, and they don't say later, oh, we have this big 1 acre property here, we could put another building on that. That's my concern about giving.
I think Charlie is our source or resource for fixes or adjustments that take these things into account. For example, a taller building perhaps could result in a reduction in the permitted density on the entire parcel.
That's what I was thinking, is that because it's cheaper to go up, which is the reason people want to go up, that you get the credit, you know, fine, you get to go up higher, but you don't get to keep your impervious percentage at the same rate, because the financial benefit of going up is a benefit to you, but that doesn't mean you also continue to take up the pervious on the ground.
The existing ordinance says 30% coverage of buildings. So if you go up 2 extra stories, maybe it goes down to 28%. Or whatever.
That's what I think.
There'd
Or
be a formula.
base it on square
a formula.
footage of buildings.
How about this other alternative? And again, I'm trying to look at the concerns we've heard from the neighbors. How about the taller buildings are only allowed if they're offset by permanent preservation of green areas, and those green areas would be Pike Field and the Aldwyn Triangle south of the train tracks.
Again, but you're getting specific to Villanova, and I think we're
I
all
know,
talking
but
about
I mean, in that same
institutions.
scenario,
Well, I think then we need to look, if that comes in and they say, I want to build a 6-story building and we will give you X number of acres in permanent open space, I would say, okay, but it's got to be within X number of feet of that building, not on the other side of the campus, on North Campus, on the other side of County Line Road. And lots of times that happens in the bigger schools where they're building very densely here and the neighbors on this side are really affected. And they said, but our overall density is fine. It's because way on the other side, it's open. Well, it may be open now, but down the road, they're probably going to suck that up too.
and that's the advantage of the permanent easement. You would be guaranteed that there would never be a building on that land. It would be a trade-off, except a taller building at one spot to get permanent open space closer to the houses.
Yeah, but I guess what Kathy is saying is that it should be ancillary right to that
Yes,
new
yes,
use,
and that, we can certainly do that.
not
Not a
just
mile
like
away.
an unbuildable slope or something like that.
And not a swamp.
Got it, got it,
Exactly. It shouldn't be something that they couldn't build on in the first place.
got it. A pond, a lake.
I'm stepping back and thinking of it and from a more generic perspective. It would seem to me that our objective by a campus, whether it's Cabrini or Villanova or wherever it is that the community would want to have setbacks away from the edges of the property so that as they drive down whatever road it is, they see green space, they see trees and so forth. They don't see the back sides of buildings. If I wanted to see that, I'd just go downtown Philadelphia where I work, okay? And we saw this with the Cabrini with their parking garage and all this stuff. Their objective is to push as much of the development as they can to the outside, so they have this almost captured open space inside, which is their campus. That makes perfect sense. We need to find a way that we can set this zoning ordinance up so that there's a reasonable balance of those two things.
If you have a more rural setting, such as you have around Cabrini and Eastern, especially along Eagle Road and King of Prussia Road, we're recommending that you put in a permanent tree preservation area around the edges. That there could be, you'd have driveway crossings, but you couldn't have anything that would intrude into that perimeter green area. It might only be 50, 75 feet wide, but the trees would have to stay. And then the problem is you can't put parking in the first 75 feet, but you can grade it out and remove all the trees. So we'd like to see some type of tree preservation area along those scenic roads.
I'm thinking along, I'm not just thinking trees, but I'm thinking, for example, we'll go back to simply Villanova. If you look at the intersection of Villanova and North Ethan Avenue along the north side of, you have large lawns that are set back. The buildings are set well back. There's green open space. I see people throwing footballs and playing baseball and stuff like that.
North side of Lancaster Avenue.
North side of
Lancaster.
Villanova.
Yeah.
Okay. The build side, opposite where they're talking about putting this, okay? And that's the kind of, even if they're not trees there, that's the kind of open space kind of thing that we want to see. I certainly understand, you get on the other, I've only been on the campus a couple of times, I must confess, I've been here for 4 years, I've been there a few times. They have open space between the buildings, you know, between the train tracks and the buildings up along there, and there's like a green artery or something. And then there are buildings and their green space along Lancaster Avenue. That's the kind of stuff that, from the community's perspective, we want to see. We don't want to see buildings built, 5 feet away from the sidewalk, because it creates a tunnel. We're trying to, and how do we strike the right balance between the right of the institution to have open space inside, and we want to have open space outside?
A certain amount of setbacks can be offset with shade trees. A certain amount of density can be offset with landscaping. A good set of mature trees has more of a green feeling than just grass. So part of it is the landscape requirements. But we also are proposing in this concept to treat the south side of Lancaster Avenue differently from the north side. The north side would still have a large setback from Lancaster Avenue. South side wouldn't, because it's intended to be a different character in that side, and because it's a more narrow piece of land where if you put a large setback from the south side of Lancaster Avenue, you can't get a setback from the houses to the south, or you get a very narrow building, which doesn't.
You can only put 30% buildings on that site anyway.
Under the current ordinance, correct.
And maybe there's a reason for that.
I mean, this is the basic premise that I'm struggling with, is that, interestingly, Charlie, and you wouldn't necessarily know this, the Planning Commission has actually not had a formal presentation of Villanova's plan.
Okay.
So anything that we've seen, we've seen it in the newspaper. We've seen it, if you watched one of the Board of Commissioners meetings, we've seen it from a distance. We have actually not seen their proposals.
I'm sure if you asked for one, you'd get one.
They've not come before us and asked for our perspective on it.
There's a timing issue there. They want to, I'm sure, do as much groundwork in advance.
But they could come in with a sketch plan
So-
without starting.
You could ask them to come in with a sketch plan.
My point is this.
Actually, Nick has a suggestion back there.
No, there's no need to address it. No, it's okay, I'm not, I'm,
We tried to come into the planning commission, and the board said.
Nick, we cannot comment from the floor.
so I'm just letting Charlie know that, so that you're aware that we actually haven't seen it formally, so we've not had an opportunity to comment on it, and I've now heard Doug say something, Skip say something, Kathy and Regina, and we've all intimated the same thing, and maybe it's not exactly the same thing, so we should articulate if it's different. Fundamentally, I don't see why we would change building heights and setbacks for the universities. That's not of benefit to Radnor residents necessarily. And so to work from a plan that has no setbacks and very high buildings isn't necessarily in the best interest. If we sat and looked at the PI zoning, and if we corrected the parking, if we corrected the loophole about parking garages, if we tightened up the counts for parking, how different uses are calculated, given that this community has a large number of commuter students, which makes different parking ordinances than some other communities. And if we gave some good thought to creative ways to let universities take a building to the interior of their campus, if they so choose, and let them go up a little higher, if they so choose, and in return give us some green space in credits, I think that that would be about the extent of the improvements that I want to make to PI. I'm not looking to build 65-foot buildings in this township. I'm not looking to build 54-foot buildings in this township. I struggle with fundamentally how that's a benefit to Radnor Township residents. I look at Penn and I look at St. Joe's, and I don't see how Lancaster Avenue or Spruce Street in Philadelphia and how City Line Avenue down at 54th Street is of benefit to Radnor Township. I just don't see it.
Just to clarify, a 3-story height of buildings could be built tomorrow. We're suggesting 4. So it's not a huge difference as far as the Lancaster Avenue site.
Excuse me, Charlie,
Yes.
you're not speaking on behalf of Villanova, right?
We are speaking on behalf of what we think is in everyone's balanced best interest. That's our goal. We're trying to look at everybody's interest.
But I don't want the public to
Compromise.
misconstrue your comments, that's all.
But what's the,
Villanova's still asking for 5-story on pieces. We're suggesting 4 stories would be a reasonable compromise.
but what is the benefit to, so what I was going to say, when I started to say we've not seen the plan, and I know there's lots of reasons for that, and I know that Villanova has attempted to come to the Planning Commission, and the Board of Commissioners has stopped that process. So I don't hold Villanova at all in bad light that they've not come before us. I just wanted you to know we haven't seen their plan. My feedback would have been to them, I'd like to see what the by right plan looks like, and then let's go from there. Let's see what value-added things Villanova wants to bring to the table that would warrant us giving them waivers from the by right plan. Because I'm not sure that the by right plan isn't the best thing for Radnor Township residents.
Commission members may suggest, because we seem to be getting bogged down into a specific project that is taking a sidetrack from what the intent of what Charlie's intending to do, is as you first started to discuss what the issues you have with the current PI district. Let's deal with those. The Villanova proposal is running a separate track through a separate zoning amendment, which wouldn't necessarily fit into what we're looking at as the overall changes to the PI district. We just seem to be going and concentrating a lot on a project that is taking a separate course. While it's important to recognize some of the issues that are coming in front of us, Villanova, let's look at the overall PI district regulations that are of most concern, deal with those, and then as we get further down the line, if it's appropriate to bring in some of the comments from Villanova, then we can do it at that time.
Could I ask you a question? If Villanova is pursuing their own zoning amendment, let's just say, for example, it passes. Would this then come in and affect that, or would that trump this, if we were to change the institutional?
It would depend on how it's worded.
Which, the Villanova zoning one?
Both, really.
Okay.
But if Villanova's coming in and they're doing or if any university is going to come in as a new use or as an overlay, then that would take precedence over the underlying zoning.
Okay. I strongly feel that doing that now before the institutional is updated is wrong. I think we really need to work on institutional first and see how things fall with that.
I think a lot of people share that sentiment.
I would suggest at a minimum of interactive process where the conclusions out of this meeting affect that process. Even if they
At
are
minimum,
separate,
yes.
they should be
Yeah.
affecting each other.
Well, the problem is we haven't been asked to review the CICD either.
Right. Exactly.
So it's hard for us to vote on something that has not had a public meeting in front of us or anything like that.
In some ways, that's when you have the most influence, is before it's gone
Yeah.
to public meetings.
I mean, you guys can correct me over there, but I don't see us having a voice at this time on the CICD.
The petition was presented to the
Except,
commission.
except to the extent that we don't think you should have a CICD without working on PI first. That's
Correct.
Yeah. That's,
And the proposal that was submitted wasn't at a point where the commissioners felt it was appropriate to send it forward. So Villanova is rethinking to get something that's a little bit closer to what the direction that they've received from staff and from the commissioners at this point.
okay.
Okay, from all this discussion, I see issues being parking, whether it's off-street or on-street, and where overflow goes. Second one is student housing, whether it's on campus or off campus, and how we deal with that. Open space, buffering, setback requirements, and things like that, which is the open space issues. Height requirements, coverage requirements are linked to setbacks and so forth, it would seem to me. He's not here anymore, but he talked about pollution being noise pollution, lighting pollution, and stuff like that. Huh? Sloan. Environmental stuff. But appropriate lighting, but not ridiculous lighting, like you don't want to light the sky up. You know, you don't want to wash out the stars. And then the specialties are like stormwater drainage issues, and then incentives for things like green buildings and geothermal stuff like that. Are there other major issue areas that we need to discuss?
Those are the issues that are in this memo, and they've been what the public has identified, too, in their many meetings.
Are there any, I'm just asking, are there other issues, areas that we should be talking about?
The one other thing that I'm paging back and forth between the PI, it's become a common occurrence at the various institutions that there's some aspect of retail use. And I think that what's happened is that retail use, whether it's parking calculations or other things that may apply, have come under other parts of our zoning, not PI specific. And yet, some component of retail is becoming pretty common at many institutions, whether it's a bookstore. I mean, I don't think that's uncommon that lots of the universities have bookstores and they have some kind of eating establishment, a bistro type thing. I know several of the institutions have that. They may or may not partner with a national chain for some of that, and yet I don't see that use really provided for within institution. And maybe it's best to not be in there. My only comment about it is that to the extent that those uses, at least in a prior application that we had, there was a strong argument made that they weren't for the public. I wasn't going to. But to the extent that, it did come up with Eastern, to the extent that they presented vigorously the position that it was not meant for the public, when it's on a street level, it's an attractive nuisance, for lack of a better word. It's an attraction. And so we should think about if we're going to provide for, or if there's going to be retail uses on an institution, that we should make it clear that if it's at the public's, if it can be seen from the public, they have to treat it as a retail use by the public. And if they don't want, and account for parking and all that kind of stuff, and if they don't want to have to account for the parking for it, then it needs to be out of sight. There is an issue in CICD, and Skip, I really appreciate you clarifying that with Kevin. There is an issue with regard to the retail use that's provided for in CICD that causes me great concern with regard to the high school students coming down, scooting down the street to eat if there's a restaurant at eye level. And that, again, the high school kids are famous for that, running out for lunch to go to all sorts of establishments.
That's a long walk, though.
Oh, no, they jump in their cars and speed down. It's worse than
cars.
walking. It's worse than walking. So, but back to institution, because we don't have a specific retail use, we should give that some thought as well, how to address that.
We recommend that you be more specific on the commercial uses, and the goal is they are customary accessory to a point or an institution. What you want to do is you want to make sure that the commercial uses, if they're, as you said, out of sight from the public streets, that's a big help. Internal to the building, not have signs visible from a public street. They may have other people go to them, but they're not supposed to be attractive to people who aren't already in the institution.
And Charles, since we're doing this kind of a free-range style a little bit, but to amplify your point, Sue, a lot of the institutions somehow have elected to gain additional return by featuring camps and other activities during the summer. And if they have a restaurant facility or some other facility that is open to the public at those times, and people are driving to these camps, that is another issue in terms of parking.
Although I would suggest that the summer usage is never equal to the peak usage when the classes are in session. And you're always with parking looking at peak usage.
Well, I guess if it's a restaurant that's outside of the normal dining hall milieu, then the people are not, the dining halls are all shut in the summer, and this one little restaurant is servicing the campers or the whatever. And, you know, that could enter into how you design parking and the size of the use and everything else.
What colleges are trying to do is they're trying to get away from the dining hall, and they're trying to give food courts and a lot of different alternatives and a lot of different choices. I think the key is to not have them designed in such a way that they attract outsiders into the campus.
Another thing that we've run into in parking requirements, there seems to be a one-size-fits-all. But if you have an auditorium that handles a couple thousand people or a field house that handles 8,000 or 10,000, that's a much stronger parking requirement than the 5,000 students that may be going there. Also, we've had difficulty getting numbers of employees counts. I think the ordinance needs to specifically address we need the number of professors or the number of instructors, professors, part-time, whatever you want to call them, the number of employees in addition to the number of students, and then students, full-time, part-time, evening, whatever. All we ever hear is the number of undergraduate students. And it doesn't matter that they have twice that amount in staff. All we ever hear is the number of undergraduate students, and we've never gotten, at least I've never gotten a straight answer when I've asked the question.
You can actually get that data off the Department of Education website of Pennsylvania.
But why do I have to go searching for it?
I know, but if you are
let
curious,
them provide it as part of the requirement.
Part-time, full-time, graduate, undergraduate.
And then some of the schools have corporate facilities that they rent out. Parking requirements should be addressed separately for that. So I think you need to go to several levels on parking requirements. What's the usage of the building? What's the intensity of it? Is it just for students? Are they bringing a lot of people in from the outside, which a lot of these activities do? And each of those requires additional parking, or maybe not. But it needs to be addressed.
Based upon your experience, can you tell me cases where there's been insufficient parking at any of the colleges?
Oh, I can name them all night if you'd like.
I mean, you got graduations, I imagine, and
that goes
football
without
games
saying. But basketball, homecoming weekends, Villanova, and I hate to keep going back to Villanova, but that's what kind of really clogs up Radnor Township. They bus people from the corporate parking lot on a lot of these big events.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, but it just goes to show that there's not enough parking.
I mean, as long as there's not spillover in the neighborhoods, a shuttle service is a good thing.
What they have to do is put up police barricades. There's not. But it also totally clogs the street. And then that's the other issue. If you don't have enough parking there, they never have accurate parking car numbers for vehicular traffic. So your traffic counts are useless, and you can't move through Radnor when school's in session lots of times.
I'm not going to pick on Villanova. Eastern has a very vibrant summer program. It used to. Camp, and you know, when you were saying that you think the summertime is not quite as busy a time, if you would check out the carpool lines in the mornings and in the pickup times for summer camp at some of the universities, they have tournament days where the sports facilities are rented out. Agnes Irwin runs a summer camp. There's a backup of traffic on Ithan Avenue, you know, for morning and afternoon pickup. So it's not, you know, I don't have to pick on Villanova with parking. And actually, I struggle with those once or twice a year events, basketball program being separate, but, you know, do we really want to provide parking for graduation day.
I'm not saying we should.
No, but
No.
there are enough instances throughout the township where the institutions are utilizing a number of different programs. Back before, it was part of the agreement with the science building that's been built at Eastern. What's happened in the last couple of years is that the swim club, that's the swimming pool that's at Eastern, is now, I think, no longer, there used to be swim memberships, but the parking became so burdensome to people on Fenimore and Shimoni. People just parked up and down the street going to the swim club
I
at
noticed
Eastern.
there's no parking now there.
That's right, because it was a problem.
Okay.
And so there are a number of instances in the township where these ancillary uses are not adequately, we just don't have provisions for them to regulate, and they do have impact on the neighborhoods. And that's one of the things. The nighttime school programs here, I hear ads on the radio for Cabrini College's nighttime program. I know that Eastern has a nighttime program. I assume Villanova has a nighttime program. But we only calculate our parking, and our students are only calculated on undergraduate residentials. That's a really glaring omission in how we approach uses of the university, uses of the institutions. And that's one of the things that I think we want to globally think about. What is the best way to capture the intense uses of the institutions to most appropriately balance parking and traffic with not wanting to look at a sea of asphalt, for uses that aren't everyday, but regular enough,
Okay.
that they impact.
I was just looking at the time here. It is 8:15.
Could I just mention one
Please.
thing? On the institutions you listed, St. Edmund's Home was not there.
Okay, we'll correct that. I saw it on the map today.
And there's a few institutions that, when you mentioned, obviously the three colleges and universities are the most active right now in terms of some of their planned development, but we want to be prepared for the day if some of these institutions change hands and then have a more intense or create a more intense use. St. Edmunds is kind of a sleepy spot right now, but it might not always be, or there's any number of these that could change.
That's true.
And look at the intensity of development at Agnes Irwin.
Yes.
That's huge.
Did they need any variances for that, I wonder?
Yes.
Okay, it looked awful intense.
Yeah.
Special
Okay.
exception they got, not
Okay,
variances.
okay.
Well, I had also one comment. When it comes to parking, how flexible are we willing to be? Are we allowed to overlook some on-street parking that's legal on-street parking on occasion? Or are we, having a real problem with that? Because I feel like I'd rather see people park on the street on occasion if it's legally done and safely than have these huge parking areas. And also to be flexible with things like buses from other, if it's a weekend event, using the corporate center, things like that. Because stormwater is a bigger problem. Parking is a problem. Stormwater is a bigger one. And traffic is more a concern for me than the parking itself. Being safe, being able to get through the township and not interrupt the business of every resident, rather than, the parking becomes more of a problem for the user than it does for us as residents, how far you have to travel from where you've parked. So I would like to focus on, safe traveling as well as, some flexible parking arrangements. And that's something that we can't necessarily dictate in this, but we can at least,
You can allow them.
that's what I was going to say, at least have that as an opportunity.
I think by having an accurate number for parking, you might have a better idea of what's going to happen with the traffic because the cars have to drive there. And that's my concern, that I think we all know that there's more traffic there than what people say there is, just because we have to drive on these streets every day.
And I, to follow up on that, there's a balance to be struck between putting parking so close to residential, for instance, with the dorms. If the parking's too convenient for the kids, they are more likely to use their car to run around versus walking. And that's, that's something to balance out as well. And, there are some existing structures and existing parking lots at many of these, I think that the plan we're going to look at Tuesday night is a perfect example of that, where we have an applicant who is going to go ahead and build on an existing parking lot and create increased parking there, which is a better use of the impervious that's there. And, some of the other universities that already have parking lots, let's see them build a structure on top of their parking lot rather than dig up more ground to build a new parking structure. That kind of I could
Many
say
communities would
Villanova
rather
has some
see
pretty big
structured
parking
parking.
lots that are already impervious. Go build a parking lot there. Don't go ripping up more green, is kind of where and if we want to be creative and give them some credit for that, I'm okay with thinking about ways to give credit to universities that want to be as environmentally sensitive and as stormwater sensitive as they can be.
Charlie, I guess we're largely counting on you to listen to every single word while you try to take notes and still be ready
I'm used to it.
for the next thing. But I hope that you, besides that, are reviewing these meetings more than this one time or two times, because we're counting on you somewhat to give us guidance. This is such a gigantic topic. I guess when we return to certain things like parking, that it's a concern of ours. And when I think you're getting the beginning of the idea that we don't like height that much. So as this process unfolds, and I'm sure we're going to have some public comment, in fact, I'd like to get to that in maybe at most another 10 minutes. I would like us to keep moving the ball forward, but the more you listen to us, the more I think you'll get a sense of hopefully where the community is as well.
Yes. We have discussion in the next section about plans that have been shown to the township from Cabrini College and from Eastern University, and noting some of the neighboring uses there. I was just informed that Cabrini is proposing a revision to their plan that is going to move their parking deck further from Eagle Road and preserve more trees. I think that's a very positive change if that moves forward.
They're splitting their deck, which is what we asked them, and they're going to go ahead and propose a second deck up near one of their gymnasiums on an existing parking lot, which is, what we asked them for, which, yes, yay.
And it's probably more convenient for the users, too.
That's what we were thinking.
It's closer to the military academy, the new deck. On the west side, there's no houses. And again, we're concerned about trying to keep some tree preservation along Eagle Road as much as practical. Not to keep every single tree, but at least a substantial thickness to maintain that setting and those environmental features.
Charles went right there. I'm going to make that commercial for the shade tree ordinance. I don't know if you've had a chance yet to take a look at that, our existing
Sorry.
shade tree ordinance,
I will do that. I've not done it yet.
and which is also going to be revised. But
Okay, good. Building heights, to promote architectural interest, we think even a minor increase in the building height would be valuable, to go from 38 feet to 42 feet, just to give a little more incentive for some variation. For internal architecture and external architecture, those couple extra feet can really matter. The trend is more for articulated peaked roofs. It's much more, the more variation you get in the roof lines, usually the more attractive the building.
Could that be used to add another floor to the building?
Well, you can limit floors and height both, so it's whichever is stricter. So we're suggesting for most areas, you keep the 3 stories, but instead of 38 feet, you go to 42. It's just a minor variation to give a little more architectural interest. We are suggesting that we think there are some places in the institutions where some 5-story buildings would work. We're suggesting a 300-foot setback from a residential property in order to do a 5-story building. That would put you in the center of the campuses. And we gave you some examples here. For instance, Eastern's gymnasium could theoretically be a 5-story building at that site. something in the center of the campus that's more than 300 feet away. 300 feet is the length of a football field.
But couldn't 300 feet from a residential line also allow that to be right on Lancaster Avenue? Wouldn't we want
We'd
to
have
think
to
about?
measure that. I haven't measured that.
But we'd want to think about how that's worded so that it's from building setbacks, not necessarily just from a residential.
Yeah, but you'd have front yard setbacks of some sort.
Pardon?
There would be front yard and
Right,
side
that we'd
yard
have to make
setbacks that
sure
would
to,
take care of
if
that.
we were going to consider going higher. But again, as I said, my strong sense from the last couple of years and all the plans we've had is exactly what Doug said an hour ago. It's a fundamental crossroads, is that residents and people who drive by would prefer to see that stuff inside, and universities want to preserve their green space inside. So how, and I'm asking you as the expert, how do you resolve such a glaring conflict of interests, when a university wants to put their big buildings on the perimeter to preserve green space, and residents and planning and people, who are impacted in the neighborhoods want to see buildings go into the interior so that they're not impacted?
We can resolve those issues through incentives, disincentives, and regulations. So again, you tell us what results you want, and we can structure it that way. But the 300-foot setback for the 5-story buildings would keep them towards the center of the campuses.
Now, I take the train into Philadelphia, so I go right through the middle of Villanova's campus. This is the only reason I know this. But they're building, for example, down near the train station there, which happens to be a low spot at the campus.
I'm sorry, which college?
At Villanova. But it's a
Okay.
5-story building, but it doesn't look like a 5-story building from any other distance because it's sitting on property which is, elevation above sea level is so low. Is that something we want to consider? I mean, a 4-story building on top of where the gym is at Eastern is not going to be anywhere near as, I'll use the term obnoxious, as if you put it right up at the top of the hill on Cabrini, right across the street. Because that you would be able to see for miles around, where the one down low you wouldn't.
If that's a concern of yours, we can relate to elevations. It's not done often, but we can do it if you think it's important.
I'm more concerned, however, with side yards, distance to residential and other properties as opposed to elevation. Because in most cases, when you're driving, at least in Radnor, let's put it that way, when you're driving down the street, in many areas you have trees, so you're not really seeing over those trees when you're driving down the street, unless you're a great distance off. But I'm more concerned with, I think, setbacks, and if it's way in the center of the property and down low, so much better. But I wouldn't necessarily overrule something because we're at a high point.
Maybe the balance to be struck is in those instances where we were going to consider a building of that height, in addition to an increased setback, maybe that's the type of situation that we would say either by conditional use or special exception or one of those mechanisms, because we have some institutions in the township that have low valleys, and so a 5-story building 300 feet setback wouldn't be a big deal at all. And then we have some institutions on Roberts Road and Hilltop Academy, which is on top of a hill, where they could meet the 300-foot setback, and we could have this beacon up on the mountain kind of a visual. And so perhaps the compromise there is, if we're going to consider having a situation where there could be a larger building, is
Sightlines.
is put those instances to a conditional use,
Okay.
or a special exception, so that if the siting of a building is particularly egregious, it could be addressed, and not just have it be strictly by right.
I think Charlie also said that you can take elevation into account.
If you
Right,
wish.
yeah, I don't know how, so maybe that's the way to look at it and see which way seems better.
By the way, I liked your tree idea, the buffer that you mentioned earlier.
Okay. Public input. We're suggesting, and this is coming out of some earlier drafts that the township did, that there be a process to make sure that when a new institutional project, a larger project is proposed, that the neighbors are notified and that there is a public information process early in the process that's held by the applicant. Excuse me?
Not already required?
I don't know if you require notification of the property owners for a land development.
Land development, we would.
You do notify the adjacent property owners? Okay, most townships do not, by the way.
For land development?
Correct. They only notify them for a variance, because there's no MPC requirement for notification of a land development.
I guess my question is, our notification for land development is still fairly limited in terms of the number of feet. Kevin, I don't know if you can remind me of the number. The number of feet from an institution that a landowner is notified for land development? Would it, I wonder if it would make sense with an institutional land development if we should increase that notification area because the traffic impacts are greater. It's not always about site, it's sometimes about traffic. Well, not sometimes, often. Often it's about traffic.
Okay. We think the township should always have the right to require fencing where the township deems it's needed. We suggest that that the buffering and the landscaping be beefed up. Right now, there's a 20-foot buffer yard required between institutional uses and residential properties. That's really not enough. The noise controls, we have discussion here about different ways to control noise. In particular, there could be agreements that there will be no truck deliveries or garbage pickup during late night hours. Because that's the most intrusive thing for a neighbor, is to have a garbage truck smashing the dumpster and beeping up as it goes back and forth at 4 a.m., which is when my garbage gets collected, by the way, is at 4 a.m. We also have discussion here about parking, which I know is a primary concern. There's a page and a half here of different ways to deal with institutional parking. And we suggest that there be a formula to determine parking, and that formula is based upon peak usage, the peak time when most people are on site. You're not going to be able to plan for every homecoming football game, but you can plan for the peak usage at least of every weekday, and you can certainly require information on the peak numbers of staff, peak numbers of students on site at one time, and do the calculations of what parking is required based upon that.
Charlie, are there multiple ways to approach the peak calculation, or is there just one way?
There are different ways.
Because I think we would like to see that.
Okay, I have discussion about some of the alternatives here. I can certainly write up what I think is the best way of doing it. You have discussion here about some of the factors that go into it. And one is trying to guesstimate what percentage of students are going to have cars. Actually, I'd say probably 80–90%, because some are going to come by transit, they're going to carpool, they're going to get dropped off.
Do you have the ability, because I see, you have this ITE research on average parking demand. Does your company, and I'm not saying, we can't authorize it, I'm sure, but does your company have the ability to plug in actual data from the Radnor community? If I think, my gut sense is that Radnor Township is above average. Whatever the averages are, Radnor's above that. That's my gut. Now, I could be wrong.
Well, you can see right here that Villanova said 70% of their upperclassmen have cars. That's a pretty high percentage. Now, that number might not be true for every college, but that's Villanova's reported number.
And that's of their upperclassmen who live on campus?
Correct.
So then if you blend that with the upperclassmen who don't live on campus, it's probably even higher.
Well, I mean, I want to be a little careful that we don't go too far into parking, because I don't want to have excess of parking required, and then we end up with, empty parking lots or empty parking decks. I mean, I would hope that most of the institutions know what their parking demand is, too. I would hope. And that they would want to meet that themselves.
Well, the problem is they might know, but they're not telling us.
Okay?
Because they've been really reluctant to give us accurate numbers as to populations, other than your undergraduate day students.
Okay. Here's what we do. We start with a formula, and then we have a flexible alternatives. If the institution can come in and show that they have other ways of meeting their parking demand, they can come in as a special exception before the zoning hearing board, and they can get a reduction. For instance, they can say that we have shuttle services during our peak periods doing off-site parking. Or they can say we're going to subsidize mass transit usage by our employees.
Charlie, the only problem I have with that is that if their budget crashes and they stop the shuttle and they say we're just going to try to accommodate everybody on campus.
Well, then they've got to provide more parking because the modification is based upon that provision being met, and they're no longer meeting the ordinance, and therefore they have to go back and provide the parking.
You know that it's difficult to enforce that.
Part of it depends how good your solicitors are on writing the agreements. But we would hope that that would be enforceable.
It would strike us, I think, as a group that a better design up front is better than relying on a variable component.
At the same time, if someone does have a good way of dealing with the issue, that's to everyone's benefit, I wouldn't want to close that door.
Well, I think I understand what you're saying, but I think that door shouldn't be opened very wide at all,
Okay.
personally. And other people in the commission may feel differently.
No, and
I just want to pause for 1 second. I just want to ask the audience that's here, how many people intend or would like to make a comment? Just raise your hand. Okay, so we can give you a little more time because a lot of people are just here to hear the interchange in person, and
That's
I
good.
appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for letting me know.
Okay. We think bicycle parking should be required in order to encourage bicycle usage. You also need, we have to not forget that we're also talking about schools, particularly private schools, and we need parking requirements for those, and the current requirements are inadequate. Signs, you don't have signs provisions written for institutions. And we think there should be some provisions that deal with typical institutional signs. A lot of times we write provisions that say if you can't read the sign from a street or a property line, we don't care. You can put as many signs as you want inside your campus. If we can't read them from the perimeter or somebody can't read them from their house or another business, go ahead and do the sign. It's not a township concern. What that does is it cleans up the administration for directional signs and warning signs and things of that nature that the township's really not concerned about. It's not their issue. Lighting, the township needs beefed up lighting provisions. It certainly has been a concern, and as new light fixtures come in, they typically are cutoff fixtures that can very carefully direct the light in certain directions and keep it out of other directions. With the mirrored systems inside the light fixtures and the other cutoff fixtures, they can put all of the light in one direction and keep it out of the other direction. We mainly control that through maximum spillover of light onto a residential property. You set a standard, the lighting engineer can meet that standard with new light fixtures. That's an overview of some of the issues we see. What we'd like to do for the next meeting, actually prior to the next meeting, is to give you a first cut of some ordinance language. And then you can start to digest that and see if we're headed in the right direction.
Can we get that well in advance of the meeting?
I'm sorry I didn't get this out. I will promise it to you at least 1 week before the next meeting, which is September. It's the first Thursday in September, I believe, correct? Yeah, first Thursday in September is our next meeting. I think it's 7:30.
Yes, it is 7:30 on the 6th.
Okay, I promise that to you 1 week in advance.
Charlie, is it your intention to present us with our existing ordinance and do a red line draft to it, to red line changes, or to, I mean, I think it will be helpful for us if we're going to work on new ordinance language, that we be working off of our existing ordinance.
We can do that.
You know, with
Unless it's written in a totally different way, then just
Well-
highlight in
Well,
there what
that's-
is changing.
yeah, I mean, unless it's gonna be totally
What we typically
different.
do is if it's a whole new section, we just put a vertical line along the margin showing you it's entirely new.
Right. I just, kind of knowing where we're going from where we are.
Charlie, also, I also want to give everybody on the board a chance to ask a question or request a piece of information that hasn't been requested. But beyond that, when you do these changes, to the extent that you think that you're not sure which way we're headed, maybe when you do amendments, not to be political, but part of it could be in blue and part of it could be in red.
If there's
mean,
a major
options.
In other words-
outstanding alternative or question,
Right,
you're saying.
exactly.
Unless, of course, you're printing it on a black and white printer.
Well,
No,
you'll
no.
get it in color.
We would appreciate the color. It makes
Okay.
it much easier, I think, to work through,
Okay.
Could
as
I-
opposed to italics.
Could I also ask that, we've talked about a variety of different issues, and I'd just be interested to know what the subtopic, parking, and then we talked about this about parking and that. Would that be real hard to put together if you've taken notes? Or?
A summary of what we talked about today?
Yeah.
The problem is we didn't always get consensus on every topic.
Well, I don't care about consensus. I just
Okay.
want to know the issues were raised up.
Sue will have
Just-
done, I would think Sue's done
Are
minutes
there
for the
meeting
meeting.
minutes for tonight? How's this being done?
I think it's difficult to do it that fast. You really almost have to watch us again.
Well, but
Well, there are meeting minutes, so hopefully that's captured the essence of the discussion.
all right.
It's
worth
very
asking.
difficult for anyone to do as much as we've done without writing the book here, so to speak. If you go to the township's website, you'll be able to watch us again.
And maybe I can make a suggestion for us to be realistic. It would not be my expectation that you would come back with an entire draft of the entire ordinance. If you came back with a draft of the first, half of our ordinance for us to start to, don't make yourself rushed and crazy and not give yourself time to really bring forth best practices in terms of your recommendations because you're trying to get the whole ordinance done, because we're not going to get through the whole ordinance next month. I don't think we are. We'll
We'll try to give you a first cut on everything, but it's going to be a first draft, and there's definitely going to be a second and third draft.
Right,
So-
okay. Yes.
And you could address gaps with question marks and suggest, maybe,
That makes sense.
where there's a question mark, as you say, we'll tell you, or we'll try to come to a consensus of what we want and then tell you. I have one odd thing perhaps, but I'll say it anyway. You said that there'd be no change to the zoning map.
Unless you tell me to look at it.
Well, I'm not telling you yet, but I'm asking you if there are options to reduce the footprint of PI that are appropriate, fair, and correct, because I think in our first meeting, we all agreed that we had an extraordinary amount of PI in our little township.
I think you should, if you don't want all of your PI land developed in PI, you should give people an alternative. For instance, say that in addition to PI zoning, you can always do low-density residential. Or in these areas, you can always do low-density residential. So, for instance, if a private school has excess land, they have a reasonable and easy way to sell off that excess land for something that you may want, if that's what you want. But I think it would be very hard to take away PI zoning on land that's currently owned by an institution that they're counting on. That'd be difficult.
I'm not saying that. I think that would be pretty draconian. I meant something like a use ceases on a material portion, maybe it's 5 acres or 10 acres, and then it can revert to something else, or there might be a procedure to take it to another type of zoning.
I don't know of any way to change zoning based upon lack of usage.
Yeah, I know, because it's zone PI, it would just lay fallow until the next PI use came along. But you acted as if you thought there was a germ of something to pursue there when I said.
No, I wanted to make sure no one had changes from the map in their mind that I had missed.
No, I don't think I'm not trying to reach any particular parcel or anything else. I'm just saying, if there's a way that we can incentivize different development that perhaps results in a permanent rezoning, maybe that would be something that would be of interest to everyone here. Maybe I'm the only one. So you can jump in or
I mean, in
not.
most cases, you'd be talking about residential. So the question is, would the township rather have houses than institutional uses? I mean, you can look at it either way. I mean, you're not typically getting tax revenue with the institutional uses, but the residences may generate school kids that are additional costs. So financially, it may not be in your best interest to have the institutional go residential,
Unless
unless they're very expensive houses.
or
which they probably will be.
if it were to go to over 55 housing.
Which is often being done by colleges.
Yeah.
Many colleges are doing retirement communities on their campuses.
What I see changing in the institutional footprint is the opposite, where institutions are buying up residential around it and kind of gobbling up the adjacent properties into into institutional. That doesn't make it institutional, but
No, and you know what? That actually reminds me of something. When we discussed PI zoning a couple of years ago, because there was a group of us who started to work on this, thank you for saying that. It's important that we make clear in the language that setbacks for buildings are at the line of the PI zoned property, not the residential property that the universities purchase and that are adjacent to PI.
Okay,
Just because they own it doesn't mean they get to use that as part of their setback.
got it. Good catch.
Does anyone on the board have another comment at this point? Because if we don't, I'd like to, and we can always come back, I'd like to have the public comment. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Commission members, I'd like to add, or answer Susan's question on the notifications. 1,000 feet for all properties. Any land development would require notification of 1,000 feet outside of the property boundary, except if it's in the R5, and it would be a 500-foot notification ring.
Okay, so I guess one of my comments for our commission is that, do we want to consider increasing the notification boundaries for PI, given that a much greater perimeter than 1,000 feet is impacted by land development in PI? And I don't have an answer for that tonight, but that's something for us to consider.
1,000 feet is pretty big for notification. That's larger than usual. You could be talking about thousands of properties getting notified.
Depending on, there's quite a number of our institutions that are surrounded by R1, which is an acre, so it's not that many more homes. I mean, it really does, maybe it does depend on the residential, maybe the numbers should depend on the residential district that surrounds it. Maybe that should be, it's not a big thing, it's something to just think about when you talked about increasing public awareness and public notification for the land development process.
I guess, thank you, Susan. I guess we're ready for public comment.
Hi, Jim Schneller. Hope you're having a nice summer. I jog, ride the bike. Don't drive it too much anymore, but I do take the 105 bus. I take the 100 trolley, so I'm continually traversing this spot. And I naturally have an affinity for the campus, having grown up around here. And I don't have anything redundant to say. I wanted to comment on the fact that this trade-off, so-called trade-off between setback from residential ending up right on Lancaster Pike. Well, you've got a SEPTA track back there, so you really don't need any setback at all unless SEPTA insisted on it. And wouldn't it be great to have a clause in the law stating what distance a setback is required from a public rail line? I don't think it exists. But I object a lot to the fact that we could have a second Wayne business overlay right in the middle of Villanova. And you have to watch precedent because there is that stretch on Lancaster Avenue from the parking lot, the SEPTA parking lot, all the way over to the to Sproul Road. That's a narrow stretch between the subway, the trolley, and Lancaster Avenue, but what would stop that from being built 10 or 20 feet from Lancaster Pike? Is that what you want? Our comprehensive plan has a strong reliance on residential, and our history is the residential has been a wide open residential, and Radnor's property values are still much higher because of that, because people step into their car and can drive to Bryn Mawr and have an open view. What's going to happen if we start getting dense? I'm personally, and I think I speak for a lot of Radnor, is for no growth as far as the campuses. I don't think Radnor can take any more without really starting a bell curve on discomfort. And I don't think I have to describe it, but I think that height equals traffic. I don't care if they're classroom buildings or a theater. This height is equivalent to traffic. And you've got to please keep the Radnor residents in mind. Someone has to have the impetus to keep the next generation of Radnor in the same footing. Is a comprehensive plan enough of an impetus for you? I think if more people turn out, and they certainly will be if some of this stuff ends up on paper, you can lean back a little bit and say, not so fast. I think that if I wanted to say something theoretical, Susan seems to be voicing some interesting topics along these lines. And it would be encouraging to the Radnor residents if this was a common theme through all of you of looking out for the residents and the commuters, the local commuters. And that includes, of course, Conestoga Road and County Line Road, both of which are going to really suffer. As far as an underpass and similar topics, I'd like to say that Villanova, they don't have a representative here, I think, has a lot of money. I mean, I don't think $2 million for an underpass would be a bad investment for them because they're looking ahead to 50 and 75-year plans. And do they want to be the campus with the very unattractive situation for students going from the dorm to the campus? I don't think so, and a couple of trees isn't going to change it. Likewise, with height. I object a lot to height because of the appearance of Radnor and also what it means as to traffic and pedestrian traffic, which is a good thing in some cases. But just as you might encourage an underground level or two for parking, you can encourage a level or two underground for classrooms. Penn has done that. Penn has one building that's, I think, 10 stories underground. Not all that expensive. Finally, I have a couple of basics. I don't think that the Board of Commissioners should be presented with what is a mishmash of approaches. And I don't think that the way the Board of Commissioners has failed to send this and or the PDID or whatever it is to you formally should be acceptable to you at all. I think you should write the board and say, we want to see one or the other and give us the sequence. Somebody's got to determine the sequence or the thing's going to continue to be a billiards game, and that's not right for the residents. And finally, I would have really appreciated if, for the benefit of the residents, you could include the written benefits of the changes that are proposed. If a proposed amendment comes through, could we get a short list of what the benefits are or the pros and cons for the public to understand? And I also wanted to make a request as far as public participation on a different topic. I think I should wait. So thank you. And don't forget the Radnor bicycle rider, the jogger, the person walking the dog. Don't forget to make a cul-de-sac out of Aldwyn Lane.
Thank you. Philip R. from Meredith Avenue. First, thank you, as always, for your concern for Radnor residents, especially as you try to balance the needs for the residents against the planned institutional and any other entities that come before you. I really just wanted to bring up, excuse me, three things that that you guys have actually begun to touch upon, and thank you, encourage you to continue to look at that. The first one is the issue of, in principle, what is the policy regarding a the public roadway? How you treat that, and how is that considered? For example, Mr. Schmiel just says that we want to define setbacks to emphasize what's most important, and later he says that houses are what needs most attention. And so we're seeing where we're defining setbacks from residential lines. Well, there is no residential line technically on Lancaster Avenue, and yet they actually have property on both sides. One could imply from that they own Lancaster Avenue because there's nothing in between that is residential. So I'm going to encourage you to grapple with that question as you think about this, not only for the Villanova area, but any other area where the plan's institutional, because you may make the argument, or I may make the argument that, residents travel behind there and in between there. They don't own that road. Obviously, there's some interior roads that obviously applies to, but what is the role of a public conveyance or public highway in terms of where you start defining setbacks from? I liked your idea of making a kind of a sliding scale, height versus setbacks. That seems to make common sense in that sense. So that's one thing I encourage you to think about and to begin to define, because that will start to shape the policy. The second is also encourage you to remember, as you brought up, Ms. Stern, about how Radnor encourages some buildings to be placed close to the highway, to the roadway, as it is in the Wayne area there. But that argument kind of can't be used when you're talking about higher buildings, 4 and 5 stories high. I mean, they limited the height of that to 3 stories. So you can't use one argument on one side and then not take offense to take into account the other side of it. And lastly, I just remind us of what the uses are here, especially in the one on the Villanova. And that is, this is not an office building, it's not a classroom building, this is a residence building. And in some respects, aren't we really talking about placing the equivalency of the Radnor House occupancy right 10 feet from Lancaster Avenue? So that's a very intensive usage. I mean, people walk around these things, they walk back and forth. This is a very people-intensive thing. So I think that has to be part of your discussion and part of your thinking about the uses of these buildings and how that relates to the environment. So I encourage you to grapple with those issues. I know you really will, and thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Well, I guess at this point there is an opportunity for anyone on the board to make a comment, but I guess there would be no old business and new business. This is a special meeting. When is our next meeting? I'd like to let the public know on this
Tuesday.
particular topic with Charles.
Your regular scheduled Planning Commission meeting is this Tuesday coming up. The next meeting for the Plan Institutional is September 6th, which is a Thursday, and it is at 7:30.
7:30 as opposed to 7 p.m.
Correct.
Okay. So, Charles, I want to thank you on behalf of the community and the board, and I'm sorry I did cut you off. Does anyone have a last comment for Charles?
I like everything that you're bringing forth for us to consider. Obviously, you have a different perspective than we do. Radnor's very slow to change, very slow to change. But I think a successful ordinance has to have some benefits for the planned institution as well as for the residents. Otherwise, it's not going to be successful.
Susan?
No, thank you for your work.
Thank you. And if you do come across something else, because you are the icebreaker in our major review of our ordinances, something that we haven't brought up, just for example, that Sloan Walker brought up a few things about lighting, and there may be another issue that we haven't considered, and please bring it to our attention.
And same way with the commission members, please, as you think of things, I'd welcome comments. The one thing we cannot do, of course, is make decisions online, but we can pass ideas back.
I had one other comment that I meant to make earlier. When we were talking about the setback from Lancaster Avenue and you felt that it was too narrow, I agree with you. One thing I think we have to consider is the space between Lancaster Avenue and the sidewalk, because in the winter, when the roads are plowed, the snow just goes up and you have no sidewalk anymore. So there needs to be a big enough space between the road and where the sidewalk starts and where the buildings and so forth are. So it has to be a lot greater than what they're talking about now on there.
We talked about amenities along the whole length of Lancaster Avenue, decorative features. I would just add that in order to have some of these streetscape amenities, you'd probably need a few more feet anyway.
Yeah, and someplace for the snow to land.
Yes.
My only comment is the only people right now we're asking for ideas from, issues. Anybody from the public who wants to come, send us a note, send us a letter or something, because we don't want just the 6 or 10 or one of us to miss something important. Thank you.
Okay. All right, everyone. Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Okay.
Yeah, have a good night.
Adjourn.